So, my dear people of God, we have been treating the commandments, and we are going to close up with the commandments today. And of course, the next part of the Catechism that we are going to talk about will deal with Christian prayer. You remember at the very beginning, when we gave the structure of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we mentioned that the Catechism of the Catholic Church was divided into four main parts. And we mentioned that the root that conditioned the structure of the Catechism of the Catholic Church came from Acts chapter 2, verse 42. And he was talking about the life of the early Christian community, how they came together to listen to the teachings of the apostles, to break the bread, and to pray. In introducing the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we said the Catechism of the Catholic Church begins with what we call the prologue. And the prologue runs from paragraph 1 to paragraph 25. After that, we went to the first part of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which deals with the profession of the Christian faith. And the profession of the Christian faith runs from paragraph 26 to 1065 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church. That was the first part. Then the second part of the Catechism of the Catholic Church deals with the celebration of the faith. And in that way, we spoke about the liturgy, we spoke about the sacraments from paragraph 1066 to 1690. And of course, the third part of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which runs from paragraph 1691 right up to 2557, which is what we are going to treat now, is going to help us to understand detailedly the structure of the doctrine of the Church that we have been handling. And of course, the last part of the Catechism, which is what we are going to treat during the next session, is on Christian prayer, 2558 to 2865. That will highlight the importance of Christian prayer as far as the life of the Church is concerned. So today we are going to look at the 9th commandment and the 10th commandment. And the 9th commandment, of course, will run from paragraph 2514 to paragraph 2533. And here we are going to highlight two main things as far as the 9th commandment is concerned. The 9th commandment, no doubt, says you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. And it's closely linked to the 10th commandment, which says that you shall not covet your neighbor's good. So we are talking here, therefore, about the 9th commandment. And to understand the 9th commandment, we have to go back to the whole history of salvation at the very beginnings to understand our human nature. The Catechism of the Catholic Church tells us in paragraph 375 that we're all created in a state of original justice or the state of original holiness. Then the Catechism says that after the disobedience of our first parents, we lost the state of that original justice, which means that Adam and Eve, they lost the state of original justice. And of course, the Catechism mentions that in paragraph 379. And of course, original sin then came into the world. But the church teaches us that when we receive the sacrament of baptism, original sin is taken away. And when original sin is taken away, what happens? We are left with a certain degree of weakness. And that weakness is what the Catechism mentions in paragraph 405 as concupiscence. And of course, concupiscence is the desire in us to sin. Having the desire to sin is one thing. Sinning is another thing. And that is why having that desire to sin is not a sin. We can refer to it as temptation. Temptation is not a sin. But when we have that desire and we actually sin, either in our thoughts, our words, our actions, that is when it becomes something else, it becomes sinful. And that is why the 9th commandment wants us to talk about the understanding and the proper understanding of this concupiscence, because this desire in us to sin makes us have what the church calls the lust of the flesh. The lust of the flesh. Which means that our human nature, tainted by original sin, even though this sin is taken away at the time of our baptism, we have that desire and that weakness to commit the sins of the flesh. And of course, the sins of the flesh, what we call the lust of the flesh, the church also mentions to us what we call the lust of the eyes. Because the eyes also can lead us into sin. And of course, another area is the whole aspect about the pride that we have as far as our lives is concerned. So we are actually going to consider these 9 commandments, but our main concern will be the lust of the flesh in the 9th commandment and the lust for the goods of others in the 10th commandment. So the 9th and the 10th commandment, they are related because they all deal with lust. One for the flesh and one for the goods of other persons. Now, it is important, therefore, for us to understand that one of the things that the church asks us to do time and again is the purification of our hearts from the lust that we find ourselves in. And this happens if you're a man and you see a woman. There is normally that natural attraction that pulls you towards that woman. And if you nurse that attitude and you are driven towards that woman and you do everything in order to get that woman, we are referring to that as the lust of the flesh that we have been driven to it by our eyes. It holds good to the lust that the woman too can have for the man. If you see a man too, you desire the man, you want to have the man at all costs and all the rest. That is where the church also talks about the lust that comes either from the man or the woman, that stems from our nature, our human nature, that can pull us to things like this. And the church tells us that the human person, of course, is created body and soul, spirit and flesh. You always hear, in the scriptures they say the body is willing, the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. Now, the church tells us that because there is this lust, there is always a battle, a fight that we are going through as far as our existence, as far as our life is concerned. And this battle is that when situations of the lust of the flesh is presented to us, if we are not careful and if we are not vigilant, we may have the temptation to fall into it. And that is why the church says that we must struggle to purify our hearts. To purify our hearts so that the virtue of temperance can help us when we meet situations that may lead us into sin. Remember, we treated the cardinal virtues. I think it was paragraph 1806 to 1809 when we treated the cardinal virtues. And in paragraph 1809, we're talking about the virtue of temperance. That the virtue of temperance is important and necessary as far as our lives are concerned. Those cardinal virtues, we mentioned that it was prudence, it was justice, it was fortitude, and temperance. And these cardinal virtues are very important and necessary, especially when it comes to the consideration on the way we have to moderate our reactions and feelings when it comes to dealing with our brothers and our sisters. And the Beatitudes tell us, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see the face of God. So we are all invited, therefore, to purify our hearts, to purify our souls, especially when we have desires, when we have feelings that are contrary to what God wants us to do. That the feelings will be there, yes, they will be. But the problem is when they are there, how do we moderate it? How do we control it? How do we channel it in such a way that it doesn't lead us into sin? That is the crux of the matter, and that is what is important for us to note. Yes, the pure in heart are promised that they will see God face to face and even be like God. And of course, we have to struggle every day that as we are having this battle between our flesh and what the will of God is for us, that we ask God for the graces that we need that will be able to accompany us, that will be able to assist us in whatever we are doing as far as our lives are concerned. Now, this means that we must always consider what the church considers to be the battle for purity. That we must always know that we are like in a war front. And we must always take safety measures that will prevent us from getting into situations that will lead us into sin. We know, of course, as we have mentioned, that baptism purifies us from our personal sins and also takes away original sin. But, of course, with concupiscence, that desire to sin in our hearts, we still have to continue to struggle in order to see how we can always win in this battle so that we do not fall into sin. And of course, for this to happen, in this battle, for us to succeed, there are some recommendations that is given to us in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 2337. The first is that by the virtue and gift of chastity, because chastity lets us to love upright and to love with an undivided heart. Anybody who is living a chaste life, maybe as a cleric, maybe as a married person, maybe as a single person, must practice the virtue of chastity. To have an undivided love for the person that you have given your heart to. Then for us to accomplish or to win this battle that we may find ourselves in, we must always try to purify our intentions. What is my intention for doing this or that? These intentions, they consist in seeking the true end of the human person with simplicity of vision. The baptized person, therefore, seeks to find and to fulfill God's will in everything. Also, by the purity of our vision, our external and internal vision, by the discipline of our feelings and our imaginations, by refusing all complicity in impure thoughts that incline us to turn aside from the path of God's commandments, appearance arouses yearning in fools, as we are told. And of course, finally, by prayer. We need to pray when we are faced with temptation. We need to ask for God's blessings and guidance on us when we are faced with temptation. We need to ask God for the graces that we need to overcome temptation. Sometimes some people think that they are strong and that they can overcome no matter the circumstances or situations in which they find themselves in. Before long, without the support of God's grace, without prayers, they discover that they are as good as nothing.
Merci beaucoup.